We are going live right now with The Great Gatsby, and I am going to be recording this, and so hopefully sometime tonight, at least tomorrow, I'm going to be posting this video on YouTube, and so it can have a longer shelf life because I've heard from a lot of you saying that you want to attend but that you have class and other things because of different time zones. So what we're going to be doing today is 1 hour, and I'm going to be spending that time reading chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby, and as I do, I'll be flagging some things, probably putting my own commentary in it as well, but things that are important to look at. And also, as I read it, and if you have comments and questions, absolutely use the chat for that. And if you see, this is the first time I've done anything live, and so I'm not sure if this is how it works, but if it works, please like someone else's question or upvote it, just so that at the end, when I answer questions, which I promise I will be doing, I'm going to be able to actually get to ones that a lot of you have questions about. And so that's what we can expect for this next hour. And then also, if I get cut off, because I think there's a 1 hour time limit for this, I will absolutely still be answering questions, and here's how. Go back to the original invite for tonight that I posted yesterday about the live streaming and post your question there. And afterwards, I'm going to go ahead and see if there are additional questions. So even if we get cut off, put your questions there, and then I'll be able to respond to them. Also, at the end of me doing this, I'm going to post me not looking all casual like I am right now, even though this is more like a blanket jacket than anything. I'm going to be doing my dapper video of chapter 1 for my takeaway with The Great Gatsby. So, with much ado, here's what we're going to do. Get your copy of your book, because as I'm reading, you're going to be taking notes. And here's how you're going to be taking notes. You see this right here. You can underline, and when you come across something you think is interesting, you underline and you write your commentary about that. Another big thing that you're going to want to do anytime you're taking notes on any book, not just for The Great Gatsby, is when you come across a lit term. If it's one that's really easy for you, circle the lit term and write what that term is, and then keep reading. If it's a term that it takes you a little bit of figuring out, like if it's mood or tone or syntax or symbol or something that's not as easy for you, you're going to circle it, do a little bit of research to see if this is an actual real lit term that you've spotted. And if it is and it's a hard one, put some key words of that definition in there, because when you're going to do that later on, when you look at your notes, it'll be much easier for you to remember those harder to understand lit terms. So those are just some things to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and start reading. I'll give my commentary as I read chapter 1. And then again, at the end, I will have dedicated time for your questions and answers. And if there's a question that I do not get to, absolutely use the comment section in the invite that I sent yesterday, and I will get to your question that way. So here we go. Chapter 1 of Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. Again, take out a pen, write notes in the book as I read. Here we go. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages you had. So don't judge, don't criticize. You've had advantages, a lot of other people haven't. I think we can relate to that to some degree, right? He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears to a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician. God forbid, right? Because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, so pretending to sleep so he doesn't have to listen to people, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. Remember that horizon, that's where the green light is too. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. Remember, that's what Gatsby is filled with, hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forgot that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat. A sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth, as in, you don't get to choose some of the things that you're born with, but some of the other things you do get to choose. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I came to the admission that it has its limit. So he has his, he has a limit, right? Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. This is the first instance that he may not be a reliable narrator. He doesn't care if something has solid foundations or not solid foundations. So write that note. All right. When I came back from the East, last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more righteous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. So he's seen too much. Only one person's the exception. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have unaffected scorn, meaning Gatsby's the exception to the rule. He loves Gatsby. All right? Again, is he a trustworthy narrator or reliable narrator? So, if personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. That's how big his personality was, 10,000 miles, and you can still feel Gatsby. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift of hope. If you have too much hope or not enough, that's Pandora's box. Hope was the one thing left in Pandora's box. And the Greeks believed that if you had too much of it, it was like wine. It would get you drunk and you lost perspective of reality. But if you don't have enough hope, then what kind of life are you going to be able to lead if you can't hope for something better? Keep that in mind. It was an extraordinary gift of hope, a romantic, not real, romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, in which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. That's the exposition. My family had been prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for not one, not two, 3 generations. So he's not fresh off the boat. He's been here a while, Nick. The Carraways, his name, Carraway, he gets carried away with things, or he cares away from his own situation. His cares are off way in left field, right? So he's carried away. Again, think of the importance of his name. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the dukes, of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent to substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. Who has a painting of their family? He comes from money. Let's be clear right here. Even if he's not living in East Egg, even in West Egg, he has portraits of his family. They have money. All right. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War, World War I. I enjoyed the countrade so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like this ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bonds business. Keep in mind, Valley of Ashes between East and West Egg, Middle America, Midwest where he's from, just keep that in your mind as you keep reading. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me and finally said, why, yes, with a very grave, hesitant faces. Like, all right. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east. Look at that, dragging his feet. Of course he was. Permanently, I thought, in the spring of 1922. So we know we're in the roaring 20s right now. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city. Of course, that's the practical thing to do. But in a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it seemed like a great idea. Sure, you want to bring a friend, bring a buddy system. It always is good. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow, at $80th a month, but at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog. Of course you did. At least I had him for a few days until he ran away. Very responsible guy, this Nick Carraway. Cares away, including where his dog is, who knows. And an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. That was a lot of money to have an electric stove back then. Again, he's not impoverished. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. How do you get to West Egg Village? He asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. Okay, you just gave him directions. He's romanticizing him, telling him where to go. All right, so again, romanticism, realism. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. Cyclical time, that's the one thing that does repeat. Not the past, the seasons, okay? There was so much to read for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down of the young breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money, all right, from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Macinus knew. There's some illusions right there. King Midas, his touch turned everything to gold. Gold. We'll get there. And as I had the high intention of reading many other books besides, I was rather literary in college. One year, I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. So we now know he went to Yale. This is a hard school to get into, and one that you needed a lot of money to also attend back then, just as you do now. And now, I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man, the Renaissance man, right? Here we go. Thank you, Renaissance man. This isn't just the epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. One vantage point to look in something, and that's perspective. All right. Thank you, very trustworthy narrator. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities of North America. It was on that slender, righteous island, which extends itself due east of New York, where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. Check out this visual imagery. Great lit term right here is this description of it. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eyes, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay. Just out into the most domesticated body of salt water is the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They are not perfect ovals. Like the egg in the Columbus story, they are both crushed flat at the contract end. But their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. Easy to confuse, he thinks, east versus west. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. So now he's actually going to talk about what's different between the two. So this is really good concrete detail, if you need, of the differences between Est egg versus West egg. I lived at West egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. So there's 4 seasons in the year, so 12 or $15,000, that's a lot of money. So even if he's trying to describe that it's a shack, is it really though? It's still a house that's costing that much money. All right. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new on a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool and more than 40 acres of lawn. This is not a small house to the left or right of him, okay? Like, he has plenty of money. Again, how reliable is he as a narrator? Okay, let me get back to it. It was Gatsby's mansion. Here we go, now Gatsby. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. I wonder how many times in life he's been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires. If you go to Beverly Hills, okay, if you have millionaires to the left and right of you, you don't live in a shack. All right. All for $80 a month. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable, here we go, now it's East Egg, of East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins. Now is where the story begins. Lots of context, and now story begins. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with Tom Buchanan's. Daisy was my second cousin, once removed, and I'd known Tom in college, so Yale man. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago, so he knows them clearly very deeply. Second cousin, twice removed, spent 2 days with them, so again, this is, all right. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors the anticlimax. So he peaked, Tom, at 21 and apparently hasn't done much since. That's what he's saying here. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It must be like to be able to have money for polo ponies. They're doing just fine too. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. That's right. Why they came east, I don't know. Keep that in mind when you get to the very end of this book, all right? Why they came east, why did they need to come east? I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. All right. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever, seeking little, wistful for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. They're drifting because they can. They have the money to not have to take routes and have a mortgage and make monthly payments. That's how rich they are. They can do whatever they want and be careless, and it doesn't matter because they use money to get themselves out of things. All right. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see 2 old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful, pay attention, now we have colors. Red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran towards the front door for a quarter of a mile. My goodness, that's a backyard or front yard, whatever it is. They have property. Jumping over sundials. Now we see time, sundials, okay? Jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Look at that imagery. Gardens are burning, all right? Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines as though the momentum of its run, the front was broken by a line of French windows glowing now with reflected gold everywhere, and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. I bet he did. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30. Interesting, 30. That's the typical, middle age of somebody. Not in their roaring 20s anymore, but now 30. And remember that because Nick, he ages in this by 1 year too. So keep that in mind and see how old Nick turns. All right. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. That visual imagery and what it connotates, all right? Take a note. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing and you could see a great pack of muscles shifting. This is a very big dude, all right? Like quarterback style, a big dude. A muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage. A cruel body. That probably established dominance, cruel body, most important parts of the entire paragraph. This is not a pleasant description. Keep that in mind. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked. Even he's there looking down on people that are supposedly his friends. And there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger or more of a man than you are. Now, mind you, he's not actually saying that. That's just what Nick is there characterizing as this guy's physical appearance. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me, of course, and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. I've got a nice place here, he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved. Look at that. He's even guiding him, dominating over Nick's appearance, saying, look over here, right? So turning him around. By one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide-off shore. It belonged to Demain the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. Just imagine that, like 180-degree shift. We'll go inside. Not asking, saying we are going to do this thing. We're going to go inside. Nice man. We walked through a high hallway into a bright, rosy-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as the wind does on the sea. This, by the way, is beautifully illustrated in Baz Luhrmann's The Great Gatsby. Perfect opening scene is in that movie. So if you want to see the visual imagery, go there. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white. There we go. Again, colors, circle that. They were both in white and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows and the cotton wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless and with her chin raised a little as if she were balancing something on it which was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into the murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. Keep in mind, he was dragged there by Tom, and yet he's there feeling that he's the one who needs to apologize. The other girl, here we go, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. Making an attempt, but no, she can't be bothered. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again, as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she so much wanted to see. That was the way she had. So keep this in mind with Daisy. She hinted in a murmur that was a surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her in a relevant criticism that made it no less charming. He's charmed by her, even though he knows exactly what she's doing and how she's doing it. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered, and she nodded at me almost imperceptibly and then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology arose to my lips. Why is he needing to apologize? All right. Almost any exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. Underline this. This is important. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down, as if speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes, and a bright, passionate mouth. But there was an excitement in her voice. This is it. Keep underlining. I'll tell you when to stop. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who cared for her, here we go, just make sure you're underlining this. This is good stuff that's important. But there was an excitement in her voice that men who had cared for her found difficult to forget. A singing compulsion, siren song, all right? A singing compulsion. Just making this very deliberate so you pay attention here. A whispered listen, a promise, her voice full of promise. A promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour, hovering like maybe on the horizon. All right, keep that in mind. I told her how I stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people, like the 12 wise men, 12 always means something. You can Google that later. How a dozen people, dozen roses, again, dozen people. Here we go. Sorry, I'm just getting sidetracked here. Dozen people had sent their love through me. Do they miss me? She cried ecstatically. The whole town is desolate. All the cars have left the rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night in the North Shore. Exaggeration, hyperbole, great lit term right here. How gorgeous. She's so excited. How gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. She sees the attention. She wants it. Then she added irreverently, you ought to see the baby. I'd like to. She's asleep. She's 2 years old. Haven't you ever seen her? Never. Well, you ought to see her. She gets cut off right here. Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly, so much restlessness, restlessly above the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. "What are you doing, Nick?" Okay, she wasn't done talking. International Women's Day today, all right? Ladies, we need to be glad that it is not the 1920s anymore and that we don't have this guy in our lives. Just saying. All right. "What are you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bond man." "Who with?" I told him. "Never heard of them," he remarked decisively. This annoys me too. "You will," I answered shortly. "You will if you stay in the East." "Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry," he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me as if he were alert for something more. "I'll be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else." It's always whatever he says, apparently anything goes. At this point, Miss Baker said "absolutely" with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently, it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. "I'm stiff," she complained. Stiff meant drunk. "I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember." "Don't look at me," Daisy retorted. "I've been trying to get you to go to New York all afternoon." "No thanks," said Miss Baker, to the not one, not two, not three, but 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. "I'm absolutely in training." "Training for what? Come on, you're drinking right now." Her host looked at her incredulously. Right? Like, get real. You're not going to be training for anything if you're drinking like that. "You are." He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. "How will you ever get anything done is beyond me." I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. Right? You have a lot of money. How much are you actively working versus just spending time doing things? I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, another color, her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her somewhere. We don't know where. "You live in Westate," she remarked contemptuously. "Oh, nice, all right. You just meet someone and she's already there throwing shade at your direction. Like, come on, that's not polite." "I know somebody there." "I don't know a single—" "You must know Gatsby." "Okay." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me. Look at the verbs that are used for Tom. Compelled, like very kinetic verbs. He's very aggressive. Look at the verb, word choice, diction. This is it. Yes, I'm seeing your question right now. You should definitely be highlighting and taking notes right now. All right. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square, like a game. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the two young women preceded us out onto the rosy-colored porch open toward the sunset. It's not sunrise, sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day in the year." She looked at us radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" "I always watch for the longest day in the year and then miss it." Who does that? Who has that kind of time? "We ought to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the tables as if she were getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What'll we plan?" She turned me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Princess." "All right." Before he could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look," she complained. "I heard it." She's not planning a whole lot. She's getting distracted. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big honking physical specimen of a... She gets cut off again. So we see physical abuse happening to her right now. And it starts there, and it doesn't end there. I hate that word hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Of course, because it shines light onto what he's actually like. Hulking, insisted Daisy. A little firecracker right now. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively and with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter. That there was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening too would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different. Here we go. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its close in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself, unfulfilled desire, even if it's dinner we have described right here. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed on my second glass of corky but rather impressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? Crops, so that's where you see Midwest. You get a lot of crops, you get a lot of fields of different things like the grains and corn. So he wants a topic to talk about that he feels comfortable with. That's what he's saying. I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. Words have consequences, as he's going to learn. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read, oh boy, here we go. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book and everybody ought to read it. The idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. He's trying to use a book to prove his racism. Okay, let's just be really clear what he's doing right here. And now Daisy. This is actually really funny. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word? He cuts her off again. Second time, again. He very aggressive. Make that note in your copy of the book. He does it with words and he does it with actual physical bodies, her body, abusive in that way. Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow's worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will have control of things. Like he is trying to control things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously towards the fervent son. You can see how serious she's taking him right now, and you can see how serious he's taking himself. You ought to live in California, began Miss Baker again, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. This idea is that we're all Nordics. He's still going on. He's not listening or paying attention to what the women are saying. He's on a roll, and he's going to keep interrupting and keep going. Ugh. Man, this guy. On International Women's Day, my goodness, this is not appropriate. This idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and after an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy, his own wife, is when he then waits to include her. With a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we produce all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Yeah, he is a rider of horses, football guy. He's not there actually being able to talk eloquently about stuff, as we're seeing right here. Do you see? That's him saying that, not me. But I guess I'm asking if you see and understand that too. So here we go. There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him anymore when almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler, just take that in. He's talking about race. What color of skin do you think the butler is, especially in the 1920s? He's doing and saying all of these very nasty things that are racist in front of someone who is likely there, not who is white, but is someone who has colored skin. Like this guy, he needs some manners. All right, here we go. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? She's, again, very profound things that she's saying. That's why I came over tonight. Of course, he's flattering her. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. Like silver service, like the only thing these people did was polish silver. That's what that meant. Like what the Queen has, I'm sure, in England. I don't know that actually for a fact if the Queen has someone just polishing silver. I think though, because my goodness, she has a lot of money. He had to polish it from morning till night until finally it began to affect his nose. Then she gets interrupted again, this time by Miss Baker. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Baker. Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic. See, idealized, romanticism, romantic. The sun is being made figurative right here. It's just the sunset, but think of how he's describing things. For a moment, the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward, as we already were told by him, breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside. We don't know. Does it increase or decrease our desire if we don't know? Think of how desire works in this book, starting with this, the information that explicitly is not given to us as readers. Nick could say what it was. He could invent something if he wanted. He's not doing that, though. As if his absence quickened something within her, Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. I'd love to see you at my dinner table. At my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose. I don't think guys are typically described that way, by the way. But it's what she can do. It's what she can use in her frame of reference to compare Nick to something good. Something that she thinks is positive. Even if it's the wrong comparison. I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose. An absolute rose, doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. She needs this. An absolute rose. This was untrue. Nick is saying this now, not me. I am not even faintly like a rose. Look at this. His own masculinity in question right here. I'm not a rose. Not me. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed her from as if her heart was trying to come out to you concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself and went into the house. Miss Baker and I exchanged a short glance like, what was that all about? Devoid of meaning. I was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, shh. She's trying to listen to that's what she's saying. She's telling him to shush. He wants to figure out and have a conversation. She's like, shush. A subdued, impassioned murmur was audible in the room beyond, and Miss Baker leaned forward, unashamed, trying to hear. The murmur trembled on the verge of coherence, sank down, mounted excitedly, and then ceased altogether. This Mr. Gatsby you spoke of is my neighbor, I said. Don't talk. I want to hear what happens. Is something happening? I inquired innocently. You mean to say you don't know? Said Miss Baker, honestly surprised. I thought everybody knew. I don't. Why, she said hesitantly, Tom's got some woman in New York. Got some woman? I repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think? Almost before I had grasped her meaning, there was the flutter of a dress and the crunch of leather boots. See how you hear before you see things in this book. And Tom and Daisy were back at the table. It couldn't be helped, cried Daisy with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced searchingly at Miss Baker, and then at me, continued, I looked outdoors for a minute, and it's very romantic outdoors. Romanticism versus realism right here. There's a bird on the lawn that I think must be a nightingale come over in the Cunard or white star line. He's singing away, her voice sang. It's very romantic, isn't it, Tom? Very romantic, he said, and then miserably to me, if it's light enough after dinner, I'm going to take you down to the stables. Going to his comfort zone. Forget the romanticism. He wants to show the horses off. The telephone rang inside, startlingly, and as Daisy shook her head decisively at Tom, the subject of the stables, in fact, all subjects, vanished into air. Among the broken fragments of the last 5 minutes at the table, I remember the candles being lit again, pointlessly, as I was conscious of wanting to look squarely at everyone and yet to avoid all eyes. I couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, but I doubt if even Miss Baker, who seemed to have mastered a certain hearty skepticism, was able to utterly put this fifth guest's shrill metal urgency out of his mind. The telephone, that's what's described here. It's ringing so loud, it feels as if it's a fifth guest at that dinner party. To a certain temperament, the situation might have seemed intriguing. My own instinct was to telephone immediately for the police. The horses, needless to say, were not mentioned again. Tom and Miss Baker, with several feet of twilight between them, strolled back into the library as if to a Virgil beside a perfectly tangible body. While trying to look pleasantly interested and a little deaf, I followed Daisy around a chain of connecting verandas. They're strolling right now. They're just walking. In its deep gloom, we sat side by side on a wicker settee. Type of lounge chair. Daisy took her face in her hands as if feeling its lovely shape, and her eyes moved gradually out into the velvet dusk. I saw that turbulent emotions possessed her, so I asked what I thought would be some sedative questions about her little girl. She has a daughter. We don't know each other very well, Nick, she said suddenly. Even if we are cousins, you didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war. He was in the middle of there in the war. That's true, she hesitated. Well, I've had a very bad time, Nick, and I'm pretty cynical about everything. Evidently, she had reason to be. I waited, but she didn't say any more, and after a moment, I returned rather feebly to the subject of her daughter. I suppose she talks and eats and everything? Oh, yes. She looked at me absently. Listen, Nick, let me tell you what I said when she was born. Would you like to hear? Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Pay attention to this moment here. It's going to be an important moment in this book, especially if you're writing any paper about female representation in the 1920s, feminism, all of that good stuff. This is where you're going to want to really tune in and listen. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. Oh no, I missed a sentence. Sorry, I'm going to go back and read it because this is important. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. Well, she was less than an hour old and Tom was God knows where. Her husband wasn't even there when she gave birth to their daughter. I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling. Imagine feeling that, like you're looking for comfort. You just came out of getting a cesarean, a something, and you're alone. That's Daisy right now when she was giving birth. And asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, and so I turned my head away and wept. All right, I said, underline this part right here. I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool. It's so ironic that really the best thing that a girl could be in the 1920s was foolish if they wanted to have a better or happier life, right? So again, it's a very poignant thing she just said. You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow, she went on in a convinced way. Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people, and I know. I've been everywhere and I've seen everything and I've done everything. Her eyes flashed around her in a defiant way, rather like Tom's, and she laughed with thrilling scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm so sophisticated. Maybe. The instant her voice broke off, ceasing to compel my attention, my belief, I felt the basic insincerity of what she had said. It made me feel uneasy. Me too, girlfriend, me too. As though the whole evening had been a trick of some sort to exact a contributory emotion from me, as if he feels manipulated here, that he was brought over just to get some sympathy, that Daisy wants sympathy. But my God, if I was in her shoes at that moment, I'd want some sympathy too. Like, that's awful. That's awful. I waited, and sure enough, in a moment, she looked at me with an absolute smirk on her lovely face, as if she had asserted her membership in a rather distinguished secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson, red, that's what it meant, red room, bloomed with light. That's because it's sunset, so the colors of the walls are turning colors like a sunset, like it's doing right now for me, actually, in Southern California. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the long couch, and she read aloud to him from the Saturday Evening Post, the words, murmurous and uninflected, running together in a soothing tone. The lamplight, bright on his boots and dull on the autumn leaf yellow of her hair, glinted along the paper as she turned a page with a flutter of slender muscles in her arms. When we came in, she held us silent for a moment with a lifted hand. To be continued, she'd said, tossing the magazine on the table, and our very next issue. Her body asserted itself with a restless movement of her knee, and she stood up. 10 o'clock, time. We have it seen here again. 10 o'clock, she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's going to play in the tournament tomorrow, explained Daisy, over at Worcester. That was my college, Worcester College at Oxford. There we go. Name also in the East Coast. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. Now he realizes his desire gets quenched. At first he didn't realize. Now he does. I knew now why her face was familiar. Its pleasing, contemptuous expression had looked out at me from many retrograde pictures of the sporting life at Asheville and Hot Springs and Palm Beach. I had heard some story of her too, a critical, unpleasant story, but what it was I had forgotten long ago. Good night, she said softly. Wake me at 8, why don't you, won't you? If you'll get up, I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, confirmed Daisy. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Okay. That's what she can do with her time. She's thinking of ways and how she can spend her time. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of, fling you together, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all sorts of, she's planning. And then now Miss Baker interrupting. Daisy's getting interrupted a whole lot. Just keep that in mind. Make that a note in your book. Good night, called Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. Pretending not to hear things. That's what also happens in this book. Pretending on deaf ears, right? Like you don't want to listen. Even though someone's going to try to tell you something, you don't want to listen. She's a nice girl, said Tom after a moment. They oughtn't to let her run around the country this way. Who oughtn't it to? Inquired Daisy coldly. Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? Because at this time period, from Tom's perspective, women needed looking after by men. All right. Again, International Women's Day right now. Here we go. Things have changed. She's going to spend lots of weekends out here this summer. I think the home influence will be very good for her. Daisy and Tom looked at each other for a moment in silence. Is she from New York? I asked quickly. from Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white... She gets interrupted again. Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart talk on the veranda? Demanded Tom suddenly. Did I? She looked at me. I can't seem to remember. If she did say something profound and she realized it by saying that she hopes women are fools, now look at her going back into a vapidness to be able to say, oh, I don't recall, Your Honor. But again, that may not be the case as well. That's the trick with this book and with Nick as an unreliable narrator. By the way, I see that it's 5:56 because it's the first time I've done a live stream. If we get cut off at an hour, I'll go back on so that I can finish the chapter and answer questions live. So just wanted you all to know that. Here we go. Back to normal programming. Did I? She looked at me. I can't seem to remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes, I'm sure we did. It sort of crept up on us, and first thing you know, gets cut off again. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick, he advised me. I said lightly that I had heard nothing at all. I hear something? I heard nothing. And a few minutes later, I got up to go home. They came to the door with me and stood side by side in a cheerful square of light. As I started my motor, Daisy peremptorily called, Wait! I forgot to ask you something, and it's important. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west. It's very important that she know that right away. No, that's just her realm of understanding and the events and things that she's brought into, especially if Tom's going to be the guy by her side. That's right, corroborated Tom kindly. We heard that you were engaged. It's a libel. I'm too poor. It's not true. I'm too poor to be married. That's what he's saying. But we heard it, insisted Daisy, surprising me by opening up again in a flower-like way. Why is she called Daisy? Gold in the center, white petals on the outside. Write that down. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Holy Trinity, 3 people. It is a symbolic number, but it's cut down by the way in which she says it. 3 people does not confirm something. Literal versus figurative. Of course, I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. The fact that Gossip had published the banns was one of the reasons I had come east. Keep this in mind, underline it, gossip, words, they all circulate in this book. Gossip is given value in real life as well as in this book. So again, words have currency. They're also dizzying in different moments. There's too many words to comprehend, right? Their interest rather touched me and made them less remotely rich. Nevertheless, I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. It seemed to me that the thing for Daisy to do was to rush out of the house, child in arms, but apparently there were no such intentions in her head. As for Tom, the fact that he had some woman in New York was really less surprising than that he had been depressed by a book. People valuing wrong or unimportant or important things. I see a question right now. Is there a way you can save this live? I'm recording this on my laptop right now, and I'm going to be publishing it on YouTube. So yes, you're going to have a live version if you would like to. I just need to figure out how to do all those things. But it is being recorded right now. So yes. Okay, here we go. So already, it was deep summer on roadhouse roofs and in front of wayside garages where new red gas pumps sat out in pools of light. And when I reached my estate at Westegg, I ran the car under its shed and sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound. Organ, again, see? Auditory imagery right here. All these sounds underline lit term, auditory imagery. The wind had blown off, leaving a loud, bright night with wings beating in the trees and a persistent organ sound as the full bellows of the earth blew the frogs full of life. Alliteration, those F's, that's alliteration. Also seen in poetry, okay? The F sound, frogs full of life, the F, alliteration. And here we go. The silhouette of a moving cat wavered across the moonlight, and turned my head to watch it. I saw that I was not alone. Here we go. 50 feet away, a figure had emerged from the shadow of my neighbor's mansion and was standing with his hands in his pockets, regarding the silver pepper of the stars, looking at all the stars. That's the silver pepper. Something in his leisurely movements and the secure position of his feet upon the lawn suggested, we don't know, but it suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself coming out to determine what share was his of our local heavens. Oh, talk about a romanticized description right here. Realism versus Romanticism. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner. Call to him, not necessarily like shouting, but like phone call. He's going to give him a phone call. They had yellow books. They had a way to try to figure that out back then. I decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned him at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But I didn't call to him, for he gave a sudden intimation that he was content to be alone. So he's thinking about it. Call goes both ways. He's thinking about calling, but not calling. Thinking about calling, not calling. He stretched out his arms. Pay attention. Underline this part. This is important. He stretched out his arms toward the dark water in a curious way. And far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except, underline this, except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. That word, diction, might as in mighty, strong, might as in the mood you use when something may or may not be the case. Okay, that's important. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished. He vanishes just like the green light vanishes. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. The reason why I say to pay attention to that is also when you get to the very last chapter, it's going to end in a very similar way that the chapter 1 ends. So I'm looking at questions right now if you have them. So I see that people are joining. If you have a question, start typing. I will absolutely be here another 10 or so minutes to see if you do have questions. And I have recorded all of this. And so, I see a question right now. What was the purpose of Tom talking about the book he read? I joined after you read that part. So a few different things with this. He's there, Tom, big words. He has thoughts to say, and he's going to be damned if women are going to be talking over him. So one thing is he's trying to recount the one thing he does know, the one book he's reading. The book he's choosing to read to educate himself to not only be a man who can ride horses is about racism. Okay, this is not good. And he's trying to use science to prove racism. So that's the significance of him talking about the book that he read. Not just any book, but also keep in mind that happened in front of servants, in front of the butler. And in the 1920s, if we think about U.S. history and what was happening back then, it was very likely that the butler, the servant, was someone who was not white, was someone who was exactly one of those marginalized races that Tom is there publicly and outwardly is saying, we need to stamp this out. So there's a lot of tension happening there. Biggest takeaway from the chapter. I'm going to publish that when I am all done with this. And the reason why is delayed satisfaction. It's increasing your desire. It's all coming back full circle. No, it's because I dressed up earlier in my little Gatsby 1920s attire and I give the takeaway there. So as soon as this is done, I'm going to go ahead and post that video and then you'll be able to have that. Tips for preparing for AP language. You're a sophomore and you're scared for the class. So in terms of tips to prepare for language is a little different than literature. Literature is all about reading poems or books or plays and being able to do literary analysis, in-text analysis, where you're able to then analyze. With language, it's a little bit different. It's more about like the oratorical, rhetorical devices you can use to prove something. Think of like speech and debate, or if you want to be a lawyer and proving your point. So you're going to learn about different things of how to structure an argument and an essay. And if you're going to use logic, logos. I have to say it that way. That's pretentious because I don't know if you can see, but in my wall over here, I know Greek. I studied Greek. So I'm going to say logos like that. And ethos, so the emotion, pathos, pathetic, that's where we get that word. So there's different types of arguments that you learn in language on how to create an essay using that. I'm looking to see, is there a way that I can scroll these? Oh my God, yes, I can. This is the first time I've done a live stream, so I don't know how to do some of these things. So thank you for being patient. Is the book a direct, oh, I see another question above here. Was that a way to villainize Tom and make Gatsby seem better fit for Daisy? Wasn't it? I think so. And you're going to see that later on. And so as long as you have textual evidence, quotes to support your conclusion, that's the whole point of a thesis, right? You have a claim and you're going to try to argue that claim. So that's how you turn your question mark and your question into an actual thesis statement. So that right there, it's a good way to be able to think about how to create a thesis statement too. Is the book a direct characterization adding to Tom's aggressive nature? I think with that you mean like the actual book of racism, not like text as a whole. And if I'm understanding that correctly, I think that can absolutely be added to characterization. The type would be indirect characterization. That way, when it's indirect, you find out things without the author or narrator explicitly saying he is a bad person. That is direct characterization. Mind you, Nick does that too. He does say he has an aggressive disposition. He very much uses both direct and indirect characterization for Tom. For your question, though, it was specific to the book, and that is indirect characterization. I'm going to keep scrolling and see other questions. What is with all the color mentioned? Motif, lit term, that's what's up with all the color. You're going to see lots of colors coming in this book, left and right and center. Gold, green, lots of gold, white. Think of the people's names. The names are very important, very symbolic. Think of the colors of a daisy. Gold in the center, heart of gold. She cares about money above all things. She values money, but really, so does everybody, including Gatsby. And so again, exterior petals, white on the outside, white. They were wearing these white dresses, white walls, and then you see color changing. So that's why you see color. It's a way to create a mood. That's another lit term for you. And let me scroll and answer some more. I don't see additional questions, but let's keep another. I'm going to scroll up because I think maybe some of you who had questions asked them as I was reading, and I answered some of those. What is it she's reading? Yes, I was reading Great Gatsby, the first chapter, and I did record it. And so I'm going to try to post it on YouTube. And so bear with me. It may take a day or two because I'm still new to some of these types of stuff, but I wanted to find a way to do it live and also have a way to record. What do I mean by the difference between Romanticism? Yes, of Romanticism and Realism throughout the chapter. So think of Romanticism as in if something is over exaggerated, if it's super idealized the way that he's describing. Realistically, it's just the sun setting. That's literally what's happening. That's what's realistic. But a romantic view of it is all that figurative language around it and how it's burning sunsets. That's a romantic idea of a sunset to be burning. Like, you're not getting sunburnt from a sunset. That's what happens at high noon. Also where there's pistols at dawn if you're a cowboy, but that's a separate thing. So again, that's what I meant is you get this toggling between the over-the-top descriptions. That's a very romantic thing. Not romantic like, oh, he's so romantic, with a capital R. That's a literary time period, Romanticism versus Realism, with a capital R for realism as well. If you Google those two things, Those are two literary distinct entities that are happening that Fitzgerald is reacting and responding to. And let me see, what's the difference between AP Lit and Lang exams? Good question. Both have multiple choice. With literature, it's the nature of what kind of documentation is presented in front of you. So with language, you could get a variety of things that you're going to have to write a type of argumentative essay for. On the other side, with literature, it's going to be about the literary books. So you're going to have 3 essays. One is going to be the open-ended essay with the list of books. One is going to be a poem, and one is going to be drama, so a play. You're likely going to see, actually, no, I was wrong. One is you're going to see maybe 15 or 20 lines of prose, nonfiction. Second essay is a poem. The poem can sometimes be a play. And then the third essay is going to be the list of books. And from that list or one of similar literary merit, you would then write an essay. So that's the main difference. Am I doing chapter 2? I don't know yet. I want to know if this was really helpful for a lot of people. It takes a lot to do this, and I'm good to try to keep doing it. I'm not going to be able to do it tomorrow, so I may not be able to do live readings all the time. I, at minimum, would definitely love to do the first and the last chapter, so I can be able to answer last questions that you may have before we are all done reading, as well as it's really important for me to set you guys off on the right tone with it. I will absolutely be posting videos every day. So in the evenings are when you're going to see my fancy little dapper videos where I'm going to be there doing the main chapter takeaway. This week, you're also going to get videos that I'm going to post in the morning where I'm going to be very casual attire, not fancy dress or anything. So if I'm not able to do live readings for all the chapters, you'll at least have those little nuggets along the way. I'm going to answer one last question, and I'm very hungry, and I'm going to have some dinner. And so I want to see if you have one last, can I make videos on AP Lit multiple choice questions? 100% yes. I'm going to be making videos on multiple choice, and it's going to be closer to the exam, just because to me it's more important that right now I'm making videos on a book because it just takes more energy and more time to read a book. I'm also, after The Great Gatsby, wanting to read and go through a second book. And I will say, I'm biased. It's going to be a book that I previously taught just because I'm going to be able to be credible on those things. And so I'm going to do a poll after we're done reading all of The Great Gatsby to see of the ones that I think are going to be really good, which ones should be used for you guys that's going to be most helpful. So I'll let you all decide on that. And then you're very welcome. Access my YouTube. I will at minimum put a comment on my invite for tonight where I said, hey, check this out, I'm doing a live thing. I'll put my feed there, or my LearnXR channel name there. That's the name of it, is LearnXR Inc. And then I'm also going to see how I can link my YouTube to my TikTok video, so it'll be easier for you that way. But I'll absolutely post and let you guys know what my YouTube information is so you all can see the recording of this. So thank you again all so much for showing up. And as soon as I'm done with this live video, I'm going to post the chapter 1 takeaway. So thanks so much, guys. Bye.